So what would be examples of verbal sexualized behavior? Behavior that is made on purpose, given, charged with sexual energy.
A wolf whistle.
A wolf whistle. Very good. That's great. You could call that nonverbal or verbal, right? So a wolf whistle, that's great. Everybody recognizes that as having sexual content.
Jokes about sexuality.
Jokes about sexuality. So often jokes are thrown out there as a test, right? A sexualized joke to see how people will respond. But that you can have a joke without sexualized sexual energy, you can have a joke with sexual energy, and that's done on purpose, not unconscious. So there you go.
Inappropriate familiarity, like calling somebody honey.
Yes, so use of terms like honey or sweetheart or sweetie or cutie pie. And then what comments on what would be inappropriate? Would be sexual. Well, let's not say it's inappropriate, it's sexualized. We'll talk about appropriate or inappropriate. So if you wanted to communicate sexual interest to somebody, what would you say to them?
You comment on their attractiveness.
Yes, you comment on their attractiveness. So in the workshop, we give versions of that, but I'll give you a version. Oh, Tom, I really like that shirt. I like the color of that shirt. Versus, Tom, you look so handsome in that shirt. It really emphasizes your build. You see the difference? And even be tone of voice, like, nice shirt, Tom, and, oh, nice shirt, Tom. Okay? So there's you can tell the energy is there even though the words are the same. So we're all aware of this, and it's happening all of the time, these sexualized content in what we say, and then what we do. So how about nonverbal? What would be an example of sexualized nonverbal? Touching, right. So many kinds of touch, right? So give me a distinction. Non-sexualized and sexualized.
Inappropriate stroking.
Stroking is a good example. So you could come up to somebody and touch them on the arm, right, like this. But if you come up to them and do this, that has another implication, right? Now, what about where you touch them?
Yeah.
Right. Very different, right? So actually, in the Buddha, when he taught his disciples about what was inappropriate, he said, you can't touch above the elbow. And that's actually a standard in the industry, in my industry. So when they do trainings at the hospital about sexual harassment, that's one of the things they say, you cannot touch above the elbow. So you can shake somebody's hand and maybe even, sometimes you grasp their boots. It's a really hearty handshake. So the trunk is off limits. And of course, breast and genitalia are off limits. The buttocks are off limits, right? So it's not just the touch, but the energy in the touch. So you can touch somebody or pat somebody in a non-sexual way, and you can pat them in a sexual way. So that's all done intentionally. It's not unconscious. When we charge something with sexual energy, again, doing that is not good or bad. It depends on the situation. So if you're courting somebody and they want to be courted, then all of that is fine, right? There's mutual consent and there's no power imbalance. All of that is fine. But if that's not the case, it's not fine. It's inappropriate and can cause trouble. So let's talk about a firm grasp on the upper arm. Okay, so a firm grasp on the upper arm. Is that sexualized or non-sexualized? Depends, right? Okay, so let's talk about the people. So if a football coach firmly grasps the upper arm of one of his football players, that's not sexualized, right? In general. But it could have sexual charge to it, so you can see, we're a little leery there. Right? And what about if an abusive husband firmly grasps the upper arm of his abused wife? Could be different feeling there, right? What about if a female high school teacher firmly grasps the upper arm of a male student? It depends, right? So you can see there's nuance here. There's nuance here. And what about, yeah, anyway, we get the idea.
What about hugging? When there is a moment of closeness between
Yes.
even a student and teacher.
Yes, well, hugging is an interesting issue. How is Hogen about hugging? Does Hogen hug? Hogen does not hug. Theravada, and he takes a clue from Theravada monks. I asked Ajahn Amaro once, what do you do when somebody comes up to you with the California greeting? It's like hug, hug, hug. And he said, I just do this. And I step one step back. Because they're not even allowed to touch from it. And he said, it's very effective, it's very gentle. You know, I'm smiling, I'm staying connected with the person, but I'm making it clear there's a boundary here. And please don't cross the boundary. So these are, you're getting into, this is not a simple, oh, here's the rules. It's black and white, don't do this, do this. It's nuanced. We have to be aware and conscious of the nuances in sexualized behavior. So let me give you some other examples from the training. So verbal behavior, revelations of or inquiries about intimate details of somebody's sexual life, right? So you start asking somebody about that. Inviting someone to share an experience involving nudity, such as hot tub, massage, or swimming in a nude beach. Sexual teasing. And the Buddha, actually, there are several instances in what the Buddha wrote about not teasing. The monks can't tease people about sexual things and can't even comment on parts of their body. They're not to comment on parts of their bodies because that automatically creates that little bridge there. And the monks are celibate, so they can't do that. Suggestive comments about dress, about appearance, about body shape, capacity, and so on. Nonverbal, certain kinds of kissing. So in Europe, there's different kinds of kissing than here. So some of this is cultural, right? So kissing on the lips in, I don't know, some families is, everybody does it. But in other families, there's no kissing at all. There might be a little perfunctory hug. So if you, in that kind of family or that kind of culture, if you kiss somebody on the lips, then it has a very different implication. In general, kissing on the lips has a sexual connotation. Especially if you're in a culture where usually you're just kissing on the cheeks. Yeah, sending somebody a suggestive card, giving someone a suggestive gift, even prolonging gaze. So gazing into a person's eyes, there's a certain cultural length of time that you can gaze into a person's eyes without it becoming sexually charged. And women, I find, know this. So women, if you're walking down the street at dusk, in a strange city, and a strange man is coming towards you on the sidewalk, and you look up and happen to meet his eyes, how long do you have to get your gaze down? Instantaneously, right? Or else what? It's too late. Some women say it's too late if you met the guy's eyes, because he's going to turn around and follow you. So this is something men don't know, but women have. This is behavior that women learn very, very early on, to not meet a man's eyes. Because that by itself has sexual energy. It creates an intimacy that you don't want. Now, Europeans tell me that's different in Europe. That in Europe, it's fine if you're sitting in a cafe to look at a strange woman and look her obviously up and down from the top to the bottom, or meet her gaze. But that's considered normal. I don't know, but that's what it is.
Is that not considered sexual?
Apparently it's not considered sexual. I don't know. I'm not European, so I don't know. But I will tell you in Japan, it is different in Japan, too. So that a woman that we know, who's lived in, American woman, was once at a gathering of Zen Roshis, Japanese Zen Roshis, and she was serving them tea, and one of them reached over, while this conversation is going on among the Roshis and she's serving tea, reached over and just started feeling her breast. And nobody said a thing.
But that's not saying that that's not sexual.
No, it's not saying it's not sexual, but the fact that nobody commented on it meant that there's different acceptable behaviors in that culture.
Shouldn't put the tea
Tea on
on
his
his head.
hand, right? area, but, you know, as I said, we do 4 or 5 classes on this. It's very interesting. What is sexualized behavior? Okay, let's move on. Oh, and in terms of the firm, the one example I forgot to give you, the firm grasp on the upper arm. If a minister, let's say, or priest, is counseling a young woman who's been sexually abused in her past, and he comes over and grabs her by the arm or gives her a hug, that can have a whole different meaning and consequence than if she didn't have that history. So when we put out the sexual energy, we're intentionally crossing a boundary. And we're seeing if the person will come back across that boundary. And in some contexts, that's great. But in other contexts, it's not great. So that's what we have to watch. Okay, now let's talk about power and vulnerability. Because remember we said if there's an imbalance of power, then things can get off. And the sexualized behavior can become a problem. Or sexualized verbalization can become a problem. So we have to be aware of power. So these are some of the categories in which we look at sources of power. So role. Give me an example of a role that gives you power.
Teacher.
Teacher. So teacher, classroom teacher, college teacher, spiritual teacher. Okay? So then the vulnerable one would be the student or the congregant. Congregant meaning anybody in a congregation, whether it's a minister or a teacher. Age. Source of power. What is age? How's that relevant to age?
Older knows more. You know, like the 15-year-old knows more than the 12-year-old.
Right. So in that example I gave you of children, 15-year-old knows more. So the 15-year-old has more power usually than the 12-year-old. So in general, the older the age, the more power you have. The young, if you're very young, you have less power. But what about when you're very old? Less power. Right. So there's a bracketed area in there where you have power. And then at the young end and the old end, you lose power. Right? Gender. In general, in our society, which gender has more power? Male. Race. In our society, more power. I know, men, you feel powerless. The women can just wrap you around the finger.